Engines filled the sky above our little mission, and every instinct told me this was no routine flight. I drove the pedal radio until my legs burned, spelling out the size and heading of the formation as clearly as I could. Then the sound faded south, and all I could do was wait and wonder whether the system would believe a lone priest on an island. Later, when I learned how late the sirens had sounded in Darwin, the silence between my message and their decision never left me. On the morning of 19th of February in 42, the northern Australian town of Darwin began much like any other wet season day. Humidity hung over the harbour, low cloud drifted in from the Timor Sea, ships rode at anchor in the roadstead, some unloading, some waiting for orders. Darwin was a forward base at the edge of a spreading war. It sat closer to enemy-held islands than to the major cities of southern Australia. From its harbour, convoys and warships pushed north toward Timor and Java. From its airfields, Hudson bombers and Wirraway trainers flew reconnaissance and patrols. Defences were modest for such a critical position. There were a handful of heavy anti-aircraft guns, a scattering of light weapons, a small fighter presence, often short of serviceable aircraft. There was no fully operational radar. Early warning depended on human eyes. Coastal observers on islands, lookouts on the ships, radio operators in small shacks along a long, exposed frontier. One of those outposts lay to the north on Bathurst Island. A Catholic mission stood near the beach. Tiwi families lived around it. A small airstrip cut a cleared strip through the scrub. In one low building, a pedal-powered radio linked the island to Darwin. The priest in charge, Father John McGrath of the Sacred Heart Mission, had become more than a clergyman. He was also an officially recognised coastwatcher. His duties now included more than sacraments and schooling. He watched the sea, he watched the sky, he reported ships, aircraft and anything unusual on the northern approaches to Australia. Most days his reports were routine: weather, passing coastal steamers, the occasional Allied aircraft heading north or south. On some days, nothing at all. Back in Darwin, the Royal Australian Air Force Operations Room struggled to pull such fragments into a coherent picture. Telephones and radios brought in sightings from outlying posts. Messages were logged, weighed and passed on or quietly filed. The officers and NCOs who worked there lived with a constant dilemma. The Japanese threat was real, yet so were the consequences of repeated false alarms. Unnecessary alerts disrupted harbour work. Sirens sent civilians into shelters and trenches. Each false alarm chipped away at confidence in the warning system. Across Britain and the Mediterranean, similar patterns had played out. Misidentified aircraft, civilian airliners mistaken for bombers, test drills mistaken for real raids. Australia's northern defences now wrestled with the same problem, but with less experience and fewer tools. By early 1942, the wider strategic situation had deteriorated sharply. Japan's forces had swept through Malaya and the Netherlands East Indies. Singapore had fallen. Timor was under threat. Darwin's wharves and airfields became essential to Allied operations in the region, yet the town remained under-defended. Intelligence assessments warned of possible air attack, but resources were limited. Radar sets meant for Darwin were still being developed and shipped. In this context, coastal observers took on outsized importance. Their eyes and ears were the only early warning network beyond the horizon. Father McGrath's routine reflected that reality. He rose early, checked the sky, listened to the sea, visited the mission's small radio room, pedalled the generator to life and checked in with Darwin when required. He had seen aircraft before, small formations, occasional Allied flights transiting north, occasionally nothing more than high contrails on distant days. In Darwin, the RAF operations staff on the 19th of February included a station commander responsible for issuing air raid warnings. He had been briefed on the possibility of friendly aircraft transiting the area. He also knew that no radar plot would confirm or deny what the outlying observers reported. He relied on judgment, experience, and a thin stack of written procedures. For weeks, rumours had circulated. Stories of Japanese carriers at sea, reports of submarine sightings off the Australian coast. Most never translated into visible attack. The sense of danger was high, but so was a muted hope that Darwin might remain only a staging point rather than a battlefield. Far to the north, on the morning of 19th of February, 4 Japanese carriers launched their first wave. Their aircraft rose into the sky above the Timor Sea. Nakajima Bifen torpedo bombers loaded with bombs, HE-3 dive bombers, fighter escorts of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. Their objective was simple and limited: Neutralise Darwin as a forward base, damage ships in the harbour, crater the airfields, disrupt Allied support for operations in Timor and Java. The attackers flew south, climbing to altitude. Over the water, the formations held tight. Engines droned steadily in the humid air. Along their route lay the Tiwi Islands. Bathurst Island stood first in line. As the noise of many engines grew, people on the island looked up. This was not the sound of one or two aircraft. It was continuous, layered, unnatural for the quiet morning. Father McGrath understood at once that something unusual was happening. In interviews and later accounts, witnesses described squadron after squadron passing overhead in numbers they had never seen before. He moved quickly to the radio room. The familiar pedal generator waited. He began to work the pedals, bringing the set to life. The operator at Darwin Civil Radio Station heard the call sign from Bathurst Island. At approximately 9:35 a.m, he transmitted the message that would later be described in inquiries and memorials. He reported a large formation of aircraft flying overhead and heading south towards Darwin. In some accounts, the wording is paraphrased as an unusually large air formation bearing down on us from the northwest. For a coastal observer, it was both precise and understated: direction, number, movement. In Darwin, that message passed from the civil station to the RAAF authorities. It reached the operations room. The station commander and his staff were presented with a crucial choice. They knew that American aircraft had been moving through the region. Transiting fighters and bombers were expected. They also knew that errors in identification could cause chaos. No one wanted to send the town diving for shelters because of friendly aircraft. In the months before, other cities had experienced false alarms. A misidentified airliner here, a training flight there. Civil defence planners had warned about the impact of repeated alerts on public morale. The station commander weighed these factors. He had no radar picture to consult, no fighter patrol reporting enemy in contact, only a single urgent report from an island mission. He erred on the side of caution in the opposite direction. According to later accounts, he believed the aircraft could be American. He did not wish to trigger a false alarm. The siren stayed silent. Work continued on the wharves. Some soldiers and civilians saw nothing unusual at all. Over Bathurst Island, the formations continued south. The Japanese aircraft crossed the coast and headed toward Darwin. Their crews had briefings, target maps, and time-on-target schedules. They expected little organised resistance. At 9:37 a.m, other observers also tried to warn Darwin. Reports from the Tiwi Islands would later be cited in parliamentary speeches and veterans' accounts. The picture for those on the ground was becoming clearer. For those in the operations room, it remained clouded by assumptions. In the harbour, the hospital ship Manunda lay moored. Merchant vessels Neptuna and Zealandia sat loaded or loading. The destroyer USS Peary and other Allied warships lay at anchor or alongside. The airfields held Hudson bombers, Wirraway trainers, and American P-40 fighters passing through. Some aircraft were unserviceable. Others sat fueled and ready but not yet manned. Time passed. On Bathurst Island, the sound of engines drifted away. The islanders had seen the first theatre-wide blow aimed directly at the Australian mainland. They had done what their orders required. They had reported it. In Darwin, the tension between caution and urgency remained unresolved. Minutes slipped by, measured only on wall clocks and in logbooks. Shortly before 10 a.m, the Japanese formations descended toward their targets. Their approach path exploited gaps in local reconnaissance. There were no radar tracks to cue the defenders. Only when the aircraft were nearly overhead did the full significance of the earlier warnings become undeniable. Observers on the outskirts saw shapes in the sky. Engines roared louder. Bomb doors opened. The order to sound the alert went out. Sirens began their rising wail across Darwin. But for many people, the warning came almost simultaneously with the explosions. One evacuated resident later recalled that the first bomb fell before the alert had even finished its cycle. Dive bombers peeled off towards ships in the harbour. Bombs struck wharves, oil storage tanks, and anchored vessels. Neptuna was hit and would later explode spectacularly at the wharf. USS Peary, attempting to get underway, was struck repeatedly and sank with heavy loss of life. On the airfields, parked aircraft were attacked on the ground. Some crews ran to their machines under fire. A handful of fighters managed to take off and engage, but the odds were overwhelming. Anti-aircraft gunners fought to bring their weapons into action. Many had little live-fire experience. They had not expected to go from relative quiet to full-scale attack in moments. They fired as they could, as targets presented themselves, amid smoke and dust. In the town, civilians scrambled for trenches and shelters. Some were caught in the open, some took cover in doorways and under vehicles. The impact of the delayed alarm was stark. Every second lost between the Bathurst Island call and the sirens had narrowed their margin of safety. The first raid lasted only minutes in clock time. Bombs fell, fires started, ships burned or sank, then the attackers banked away and headed back toward their carriers. In total, the raid destroyed or badly damaged multiple ships, aircraft and port facilities. Hundreds of people were killed or wounded. And yet, in the official paperwork that followed, much of the destruction was dated and timed, but not always traced back to a single overlooked warning. Within hours, a second raid by the land-based bombers targeted the RAF base. Once again, the defences struggled. In the days that followed, Darwin's streets emptied as many civilians left, either under orders or out of fear. The town's role as a forward base remained, but its character had changed. It was now a place that had experienced direct attack. For those concerned with air defence, the events of 19th of February raised immediate questions. Why had the warning from Bathurst Island not led to a timely alarm? Why had a coastal observer's clear report not been enough? The Commonwealth quickly appointed Justice Charles Lowe to investigate these raids. His commission took evidence on many aspects of the attacks: shipping arrangements, anti-aircraft deployment, command relationships between Army, Navy and Air Force, and the quality and use of early warning. Testimony and documents showed that multiple warnings had indeed been sent from the Tiwi Islands. They also showed that decision-makers in Darwin failed to fully accept their implications. In some retellings, a simple narrative emerged. A priest on an island had warned of danger. His message had been ignored. The town had paid the price. Reality was more complex. The warning had not vanished into a void. It had travelled through a system struggling with wartime expansion, inadequate training and confusing information. Within that system, individuals made decisions shaped by earlier false alarms and by worry about crying wolf. The station commander who delayed sounding the siren had not intended negligence. He had weighed the risk of a false alarm at a time when civilian confidence and operational efficiency were seen as fragile. He erred, but his error was of judgment within a flawed framework. For Father McGrath and the Tiwi people on Bathurst Island, the aftermath was different. They saw their warning become part of a tragic story. They continued their work as observers and guides. Japanese aircraft and wrecks would appear again in their skies and on their shores. The coastwatchers' role in the north expanded as the war progressed. Other radar and observation posts were established. Australian-designed lightweight air-warning radar sets began to arrive, and by March 1942 an experimental set near Darwin helped control the first successful radar-directed interception in the area. Lessons were being learned, if slowly. Reliance on a single observer report without technical corroboration was seen as too fragile. But so was a system that hesitated to act on human observation for fear of error. Over the following year, Darwin experienced many more raids. Defences improved, fighter units gained experience, commands grew more accustomed to interpreting radar and visual reports together. Yet the first raid retained a special weight. It had been the first major attack on the Australian mainland. It had been in scale a shock out of proportion to earlier assumptions. Within that event, the moment at 9:35 a.m, when a coastal observer on Bathurst Island described a sky full of aircraft, became a symbol. It represented both the potential and the limits of human early warning. It showed how a single decision, taken in an operations room minutes ago, could sharpen or blunt that warning. In the decades after the war, the story of the Darwin raids was sometimes overshadowed by other campaigns. Attention focused on New Guinea, the islands farther north, and the larger operations of the Pacific War. Yet for the people of Northern Australia, 19th of February 1942 remained a defining date. As records were declassified and veterans spoke more openly, the details of the Bathurst Island warning gained wider recognition. Historians traced the path of the message from Father McGrath's pedal radio to the civil station and onto the RAF. They found that the delay between notice and alarm, perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, had represented the difference between structured defensive readiness and hurried reaction under fire. They also found that this was not an isolated pattern in the wider war. At Pearl Harbour, radar operators had detected the incoming Japanese strike, only to see their report discounted as friendly aircraft. Elsewhere, coastal observers in the Solomons and New Guinea sometimes struggled to convince headquarters of the urgency of their sightings until events confirmed them. The struggle to balance false alarms against missed warnings was built into the nature of early warning systems. It affected not only technology and procedures but also human psychology. For those on Bathurst Island, the war left physical traces, wreckage of aircraft. Stories passed down through Tiwi families. A place name register entry recalls how Japanese aircraft shot up a stranded RAAF DC-3 at the Mission airstrip, and notes that during this action, Father McGrath gave his unheeded warning to Darwin. For Darwin, commemorations and memorials gradually incorporated the story of the ignored message. Speeches in Parliament and in local ceremonies referred to the missionary who saw the danger and whose warning was discounted because the aircraft were assumed to be American. In later years, historians also drew attention to the contributions of Indigenous Australians in the north. Tiwi men and women worked with the military as guides, coastwatchers, and rescuers. Their role had often been under-acknowledged in the immediate post-war period. The ignored warning from Bathurst Island became one reference point in that broader story of participation and delayed recognition. The cost of the delayed alarm in Darwin was measured in ships lost, aircraft destroyed, and lives cut short. Hospital orderlies, merchant seamen, soldiers, airmen, and civilians all appear in casualty lists. Yet the judgment of inquiries stopped short of placing all responsibility on a single individual. The system itself, from planning levels down to operations rooms, had left too little room for error and too little margin for uncertainty. Over time, air defence doctrine around the world moved toward a different balance. Systems were designed to accept a higher rate of false alarms in exchange for earlier warning. Radars, identification systems, and fighter control networks all evolved with that trade-off in mind. The story of Father McGrath's message and the Darwin Station commander's hesitation sits within that evolution. It demonstrates the weight placed on the judgment of a single officer interpreting fragments of information in real time. It shows how a coastal observer, physically far from the target but directly under the flight path, could see what larger headquarters chose not to fully believe until it was too late. In Darwin itself, memory of the raids is kept alive through annual commemorations. Sirens sound again, this time ceremonially. Veterans, descendants and residents gather near the harbour. Some make the journey to Bathurst Island to stand by the old mission church and the site of the radio room where the warning was sent. The small pedal radio is long gone, but its role is remembered. It represents an era when national security depended on isolated posts and the resolve of individuals in remote locations. Alongside the memorials to ships and aircraft lost, the story of an ignored message has become part of the wider narrative of vigilance and vulnerability. For Father McGrath, life after the raids continued on the island. He remained with the Tiwi people for the duration of the war and beyond, dying in S82. His name is now linked in histories and local accounts to the phrase, unheeded warning. Yet his actions on the 19th of February 1942 were entirely in line with his duty as a coast watcher. He observed, he reported, he did so clearly and promptly, the station commander in Darwin, whose hesitation contributed to the late sounding of the alarm, fades more easily into anonymity. He stands in for many officers in many wars who have had to decide in minutes how to interpret incomplete information. His choice illustrates the quiet pressures of command in a forward base that had not fully adjusted to modern air war. In the end, the title that might be given to this episode is not only about doubt, but about timing. A coastal observer did his work. An operations officer weighed his options. The siren sounded only after bombs were already falling. For those who study the history of early warning and air defence, Darwin's first raid remains a case where human judgment, institutional caution, and the absence of technology combined to narrow the distance between warning and impact to almost nothing. It stands as a reminder that in times of tension, the safest path may be to trust the lone voice that sees danger early, even when that trust leads to more alarms than attacks. For viewers interested in more overlooked stories of individuals at the edge of great events, people like the coastwatchers of the Tiwi Islands and the staff in distant operations rooms, this channel continues to explore those quieter, often forgotten moments of the Second World War.